Okay, and I am recording. A few things to point out. One, remember your exam is a week from today. Remember to come at the time you're. Thank you. Not a week from today. Today, I'll make a note of that. Today is not Tuesday. It's Thursday. That was intentional. I was just trying to see if you were paying attention. Okay. Tell you what, when this week we've got midterm grades due, advising. I've got 2 online classes that are starting. Too much going on. Too much. Then there's COVID. There's the election. Because I'm sure you don't have any problems. Anyway, so let me start over. Your exam is Tuesday of next week. So that's the next time we meet. Remember to come at the time you're scheduled to come. If you didn't see the schedule, it is in the announcements section on Moodle. If you have a problem with the time that you're scheduled to take it, send me an email, and I'll see what we can do to work that out. Remember, we covered chapter 27, then 26, then 28. We're in 29 now. We didn't cover everything in chapter 28, but what we cover in class, especially what we find in the MRU videos, that's what's really important for 28. We're doing 29. We'll finish up 29 today. As for chapter 30, you will definitely not be responsible for all of it, but I hope, we'll see how far we get today. I hope we'll get started on it, and I hope I will have time to do a short video tomorrow morning. If so, then for chapter 30, the only thing you'll be responsible for is what I cover either in class today or in the video that I put up in the morning. If I don't get it up in the morning, then I won't put it up. As far as sampling for chapter 30, I will extend that, and you'll be able to work on that until the third exam. Remember also that on the exam, as before, you can use a 3" by 5" note card. Not bigger than 3 by 5. I was pretty lenient last time. There were some people who had bigger things than that. So 3 by 5. Also, remember to put up your MRU notes. Remember those notes. It's not over. We're not talking about notes from class or notes from the textbook. Notes over the videos. So be sure to do that, because that's the only way you're eligible for the extra points. As I was doing midterm grades, I noticed that a number of people did not submit notes for the first exam. If you have those notes, I'll still let you submit those, and that can really make a difference in your grade. All right, any questions?
Did you say that the chapter 30 sampling homeworks are not due this Sunday?
The chapter 30 homework, I'm going to extend that, because I know we won't get through all of it. So the chapter 30 sampling homework is, you will get extra time on that. For the exam, to be responsible for only what we cover either in class today or in the video I put up in the morning from chapter 30. And then the remainder of chapter 30 will be on the third exam. What was your question? I'm sorry, when am I going to put the notes? I did grade the notes. That yesterday should be in the result. did it and it's not graded, let me know. Okay. Continuing in chapter 29, anytime we talk about something, try to make sure that you see you put it into perspective, because it's possible to go through an economics course and feel like, this was just a mountain of details that didn't fit together. We're trying to give you the details you need to create a picture, a unified picture, so that you see, oh, this actually does make the economy makes sense. We said that our standard of living depends on how much we can produce. How much we can produce depends on the production function and our resources. With the labor we have, with the capital we have, how much, with the technological knowledge we have, how much output can we produce from that? That was roughly what we talked about through chapter 28. Now in chapter 29, we're asking the question, well, we know the capital is important. We know that we get new capital when businesses choose to make investments. But how do they get the funds to make those investments? If you're an auto company and you want to build a $3 billion factory, and you don't happen to have $3 billion in your checking account, how do you get that money? That's what chapter 29 is all about. Various ways that people who want to save, which means they want to spend less than their income now, how can that savings get into the hands of the people who want to spend more than their current income? Especially businesses that have ideas about new products to produce, new plants they want to build. They got the ideas, but they don't have the funds to finance that investment. How do these funds get from the hands of the savers into the hands of the borrowers? And will there be a balance? Are we going to have too much saving or too little saving? Those are the kinds of things we're interested in this chapter. And last time we talked about equilibrium in the market for loanable funds. And when we talk about the market for loanable funds, we're just talking about people in general who want to save, people who want to borrow and invest. So we've got a supply of savings curve, we've got a demand for borrowings curve. They intersect. And one of the things we talked about last time was the determinants of saving. We said people save because they want to smooth their consumption, save because sometimes because they have their tax incentives that encourage or discourage saving. But we especially emphasize the interest rate, because from the perspective of a saver, the interest rate is the reward you get for saving. So when the interest rate goes up, that means the reward for saving goes up, and so the amount saved will go up. It's an upward sloping curve. Demand to borrow, we talked about the determinants of that. We said that people tend to be impatient, rather have things now rather than have to wait. And one way you can get more now is by borrowing, have more purchasing power now, but then you're going to have less purchasing power in the future. We said another reason to borrow would be when you have acquisition of a large asset, buying a house, buying a car, a business, building a factory. And then also taxes have an effect on how much will be borrowed. But the interest rate is very important. From the perspective of the borrower, the interest rate is the cost they bear in borrowing. So if the interest rate is high, cost a lot to borrow, the quantity that borrowers will want to borrow will be relatively low. If the interest rate is low, then the cost of borrowing is much lower, and so borrowers will choose to borrow more. So those, in intuitive ideas underlie the supply saving and the demand to borrow. At the equilibrium interest rate, at the equilibrium interest rate, that brings the quantity demanded into balance with the quantity supplied. And key idea here is that in the market for loanable funds, just like every market, you've got a lot of things going on. You've got buyers who want one thing, you have sellers who want something else. How are their actions going to be brought together and coordinated? Well, prices play that key role, as we talked about before. And in the market for loanable funds, the relevant price is the interest rate. We saw that if the interest rate is too high, then what do we have? What does that red gap represent? The interest rate is 10%, then the quantity supplied is out here. Quantity demanded is back here. If quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, what do we call that? A surplus. It's a surplus. Just like if we were talking about gasoline or wheat or houses or anything. That's why supply and demand is so useful. You can apply it in every market. And if there's a surplus, then price always falls. That pushes us to the equilibrium. If the interest rate's too low, you can have a shortage, and the interest rate is going to be pushed up. So we can say that if we have a free market, the interest rate is going to move to that equilibrium level. And at that equilibrium level, quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be equal. So we can say that the interest rate is determined by how much savers want to save and how much borrowers want to borrow. And it follows from that if there's a change in the economy, then these curves can shift and interest rates will change. And when interest rates change, remember, interest rates are a price, and everybody's going to respond to that changed price. So the interest rate, just like other prices, plays a key role in communicating information, in creating incentives, and in coordinating the actions of the borrowers and the sellers. And let's see here. So when we have a change in conditions, those curves are going to shift, and that will cause the interest rate to change. So we're going to go through a few examples. What do people become more thrifty? Which means they decide they want to save more. Maybe they look at what's going on in the economy and they conclude, no, I don't know what's going to happen. I might lose my job, or my income might go down in the future. Maybe I should save more money so I'll be better prepared. Well, our model helps us to think about the impact of that. People become more thrifty, then the supply and saving curve is shifting to the right. And that means that at the original interest rate, we were in equilibrium, we were in balance. But now that this change has occurred, we're no longer in balance. The quantity demanded is still going to be here at 250, but now if the interest rate remains at 8, quantity supplied would be way out here. We would have a surplus in the market for loanable funds, which means you have more savings available than you have demanders who want to borrow it. And that surplus will lead to a drop in interest rates. And as the interest rate goes down, well, we're talking about the interest rate. In reality, we're simplifying a lot. You've got lots and lots of different markets in the financial sector. So you have lots of different interest rates. Okay? But we're trying to keep it simple and just deal with the basics so we can talk about the interest rate. And that's not too bad of a starting point because generally interest rates will move together. There's many things, something like we're talking about where people become more thrifty, then throughout the economy, interest rates are going to tend to all go down. Okay? So as interest rates go down, the borrowers see that it's now cheaper to borrow money. So borrowers will choose to borrow more. As the interest rate falls, savers see, well, it's not as rewarding to save now. And so they don't actually save this quantity. The lower interest rate motivates them to save a somewhat smaller quantity. So we move to this new equilibrium. We started in equilibrium, we moved to a new equilibrium. The change that occurred was that people wanted to save more. That leads to a lower interest rate. That motivates everybody in the market to change their behavior, and we end up moving to a new equilibrium where things are in balance. The idea here is that interest rates, like other prices, they're not just arbitrary. Somebody didn't flip a coin and say, oh, let's have the interest rate be 6% today. Interest rates and other prices are the result of the interaction of lots of consumers, lots of producers, and we're using supply and demand to represent all of those interactions. So I know the graphs can look complicated at times, but think about it like this. We are representing the interactions of millions and millions of people, and we're able to do it with one graph. So it's a very complicated reality. The graph is giving us a relatively simple way to think about that very complicated reality. Another example, what if the economy goes into recession? We talked about recession. When we go into recession, that means that things aren't going well. GDP is going down. Well, what if we go into recession and businesses believe future investment projects will be less profitable? Again, you're thinking about, you're running the auto company, you're thinking about building this $3 billion new factory, and you see that the economy is going into a recession. And you think, okay, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, a lot of people are going to have less income. Are those people still as likely to go out and buy a new car? And you conclude, no, the demand for cars, new cars especially, is going to go down. So do we really want to spend $3 billion to build a new car factory to produce cars that people aren't going to buy? Probably not. So when the economy goes into recession and businesses become less optimistic about the profitability of future investments, then we can determine what's going to happen. The demand for funds, the demand to borrow is going to decrease because businesses aren't going to want to do as much investing, so they don't need to borrow as much money. And when the demand to borrow shifts to the left, equilibrium is no longer at 8%. At the original interest rate, we would now have a surplus of loanable funds. That surplus would cause the interest rate to go down. We move from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium. You think to recognize, we started out in balance. We had people changing what they wanted to do. Businesses changed how much they wanted to borrow. Where do we end up? We end up in a new equilibrium. We end up with a new balance. Government didn't have to do anything to get us back into equilibrium. reach that new equilibrium as people, as savers and investors, are doing what they think each think is best for them. Another example: what if the government passes an investment tax credit? If you've had accounting, then you probably know that a tax credit is something that you like. A tax credit reduces the amount of tax that you're going to have to pay. And so often when something like this is put into effect, the government may say, okay, if you invest $1 billion in a factory, then we'll give you a tax credit of, say, 10%. So that's going to reduce, by you making that investment, the amount of tax that you owe is going to go down by 10% or by some percent of the amount that you are investing. We're not going to go into the details of how that works, but the idea is the government is giving businesses a tax credit for investing, then that is causing future investments to be more profitable. And if they're more profitable, more investment is going to be done, and businesses will then need to, or will want to, borrow more money to finance them. So here, I think my graph is wrong here. Title. Because of the tax credit, investment becomes more profitable, so the demand for funds increases. The equilibrium was at 6%, but now, if the interest rate's at 6%, quantity demand would be way out here. You have a shortage of loanable funds, and anytime you have a shortage, what does it do to the price? Pushes the price up, and the interest rate is the price you pay to borrow. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that we've got this financial sector. You've got people who want to save. You've got others who want to borrow to make investments. And we're asserting that the quantity of saving, the quantity of investing would be brought into balance through the interest rate. But then we have the question, exactly how does that work? The graph makes sense, but if you're a saver, let's say you save $10,000 and you want to invest it somewhere so you can get a return, but you don't want to start a business. You want somebody else to do that. You want to take your money, give it to somebody who is then going to pay you a return. How do you find that person who's going to actually do the investing? Or if you have an idea and you want to build a new factory, but you don't have the funds, how do you get someone to lend you that money? Now, if you were lucky and you happen to be good friends with Bill Gates from the time you were in first grade, then you can call him up and explain it to you or to him, and he may say, sure, I'll write you a check for $100 million. But if you don't know Bill Gates, you can still try to call him up, but lots of other people are doing the same thing. You're going to have a great difficulty convincing him that he should lend his money to you. So if you don't have somebody like that, how do you find somebody who's willing to save and then lend that money to you? We take it for granted that it's not that hard in our economy, but it's rather challenging to get those funds channeled from the savers into the hands of the investors. And it is financial intermediaries who do that. Banks, bond markets, and stock markets. Those are the three parts of the financial sector we will touch on briefly in this chapter. Financial intermediaries play a really, really important role. People often downplay their importance. Financial intermediaries reduce the cost of moving savings from savers to borrowers and investors. Just imagine, let's say that you're an inventor and you have figured out a way that you can create cheap energy. It's not going to be hard, but it's going to take billions of dollars of investment to get started. How do you get those funds? You know Bill Gates, that's great, but what if you don't? Are you going to go down the street in your neighborhood and knock on people's doors and say, I've got this great idea, don't you want to invest in it? You know, obviously that's not going to work very well. So how do the savers and the investors get connected to each other? Financial intermediaries specialize in doing that kind of thing. And by specializing, they reduce the cost of channeling funds from savers to borrowers and investors. We saw our graph before. It's just a graphical way to represent the problem. You got one group of people who are doing the saving, but the other group who want to borrow and invest. Somehow those funds have to go from here to here. And it is the banks, bond markets, and stock markets that enable that to happen in a relatively low-cost way. One of the key differences between an economy like the U.S. and a much less developed economy would be in the financial sector, because we have this incredibly complex and efficient financial system for channeling funds. But you go to Russia, you go to an undeveloped country, they don't have the institutional framework that we have. So you may have this great idea, and you may die with that great idea because you never could find anybody to fund it. Likewise, you may have you may save a lot in an undeveloped country, but you don't have any good way to invest it. And so you may not get much of return on the amount that you are saving. Okay, role of intermediaries. We already talked about some of this. Equilibrium doesn't come about automatically. Somehow these different groups have to be brought together. Savers, what are they trying to do? If you're working, you're saving money, you want to buy a house in the future, you want to send your kids to college, you want to retire early, let's say, you're saving money. What do you want? In deciding how you're going to, what you're going to do with those funds. What are the two main things you're interested in as a saver? The return would be the obvious thing, that you have one way you can save and you'll get 2% interest, and the other you'll get 10% interest. Obviously, the 10% is more attractive, other things being equal. But there is a second thing that savers are interested in. And what is that? Let's say class ends today, and you do have $10,000 that you're trying to figure out how to invest. There's a guy standing out in the hall. He says, hey, I got this great investment opportunity, double your money in a week. Are you going to say, okay, here's my money? No, probably not. Because you're not interested only in the return that you can get, you are also interested in the risk that you're going to bear. Okay? You lend money to somebody, there's always the potential of default. They promise they'll give you your money back plus interest. They may not honor that promise. They may be perfectly honest, but things don't work out and they don't have the money to repay it. Or they may be totally dishonest and they're planning to get your money and you'll never see them again. There's always risk, and savers are interested in They want a high return, but they want low risk. And unfortunately, those two don't go together. If you want a high return, you have to bear more risk. If you want low risk, you have to accept a low return. So savers have to decide, what is the trade-off I'm willing to make? How much risk am I willing to bear in order to get a higher return? In a finance course, you spend a lot of time going into that kind of thing. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, what are they trying to do? They're trying to find profitable investment opportunities and then find ways of funding those opportunities at low cost. They don't want to acquire funding if it's going to cost them 30% interest. They want to, there are lots of different ways they can acquire funding. So they're going to search for the funding opportunity that will provide them with the funding that they want and where they can get it at the lowest cost. So the savers, investors have very different objectives, but they have to get together somehow and reach an agreement, sign some type of contract. Financial intermediaries provide efficient ways of bringing those two groups together. And because they find ways to lower the cost, intermediaries increase the efficiency of our economy. They move funds from people who don't have a very productive use of the funds into the hands of people who do have a very productive use. And as I said before, financial sector is very, very complicated. We're just going to touch on the basics, and being familiar with the basics can be very, very helpful to you in making sense of what goes on in the world. We're going to say a little bit about banks, a little bit about bonds, a little about stocks, and then in later chapters we'll come back and say a good bit more about banks. Think about what a bank does. Banks receive savings from lots of individuals. They pay them interest sometimes. These days, you're not going to get very much interest from your bank, but they do. You put your money into the bank, and they do provide you with services because they provide you with your checking account, and that enables you to purchase the things that you want to purchase. But the banks take in these savings, they take in deposits, and then they loan these funds out to borrowers. And they charge interest on those loans. If the interest the bank gets on those loans is enough to cover their costs, then the bank is going to be profitable. So the basics of banking are really, really simple. They take in deposits, they lend those deposits out, and they try to earn enough interest on their loans to cover their costs. That's what banks are in business to do. One of the things that banks do, and people often don't recognize this, banks, by specializing in making loans, banks become very, very good at making loans and at evaluating borrowers. Again, let's say you inherited $10,000 and you want to earn a return on it. And let's say you know 10 people who want to borrow money. So you say, well, I'm going to interview all these. And you talk to each one of them. You try to decide which of these is really a good credit risk. Who's going to pay me back? You're probably going to have a great deal of trouble evaluating those borrowers because you don't have any experience at doing that. You're not going to know, what should I look for? What kind of data should I get? Where do I get the data? How do I get their credit score? Since you've never done it before, you don't know how to evaluate the borrowers. You may, one guy says, lend me the money, I'm going to start this business and it's really going to be profitable. Are you in a position where you can evaluate whether his idea makes sense? Probably not. But that's what banks do. They, every day, every day, every day, they are taking in deposits and they're making loans and they're making lots of loans. So they are employing people who are specialized in evaluating borrowers. And when they hire them, they already have expertise in doing that. And then they are evaluating borrowers day after day after day. So when somebody comes in and wants to borrow, the bank officers, they don't have to think, oh, wonder how we should do this. They have a very established protocol. They know what to do to separate people who are going to be good borrowers from those who aren't good borrowers. It's a very efficient, very productive things the bank is doing. As a saver, you don't have to evaluate the people who are going to borrow the money. You give your money to the bank. The bank gives you a guarantee. Don't worry. No matter what, you don't have to worry about what we're going to do with your money. We guarantee we're going to give you your money back whenever you want it, and we are going to pay you a rate of return, probably low right now, but you're going to get a competitive rate of return. You don't like one bank, go to another bank. Go to whoever's offering you the best interest rate. Would be very inefficient if every saver had to go out and evaluate borrowers on their own. But since the savers are all bringing their funds to the banks, and the bank can do all that analysis, the bank is very efficient at it, and so it works very well. It minimizes the cost of channeling funds from the savers into the hands of the borrowers. Also, banks spread default risk across many lenders. Let's take a bank that is making home mortgage loans. Well, when they lend money to somebody to buy a house, they have a guarantee. They know for sure that the borrower is going to repay the loan. It's always possible that the borrower is going to default. Let's say that you have $200,000 and you want to lend it out somewhere. And let's say there's somebody who wants to buy a house and they want to borrow $200,000. Well, you could lend to that one borrower. You wouldn't have to use a bank. But if you did that, think about the risk that you're taking on. Since you're lending all of your money to that one borrower, then if they default, then you lose the entire amount that you loaned them. That's going to be a very risky thing to do. But when you take your money to the bank, other depositors are bringing their money to the bank. So the bank is collecting a huge pool of money, which they then use to make lots of loans to lots of borrowers. And they know that some of those borrowers are going to default, but they also know that most of them aren't. So the bank is bearing relatively little risk because they are investing in such a large pool of loans. The default risk is spread across lots of lenders, because when one of those borrowers defaults, it doesn't mean that anybody's going to get wiped out, because the bank knows that most of these other loans are not going to go into default. So again, that's another way that banks are engaged in a productive activity when they take in deposits and they use those deposits to make loans. Okay, going on to the bond market. Not going to say much about bonds. Primary thing to remember, a bond is an IOU. What does IOU mean? I'm sorry? It's a promise to pay you later. If I come to class and I say, I really need $10 today and I don't have any money, then you could say, well, give me an IOU and I'll lend you that. So an IOU is a promise to make some payment in the future. And the IOU is going to state the amount or the face value that's being loaned. It is going to state an interest rate. And it's also going to state the maturity date. So if you loaned me $10 and I gave you an IOU, then it would say, I owe you $10. It would state the interest that I'm going to pay you. Let's say I'm going to pay you 10%. And it would state when that's going to be repaid. Let's say in 1 year. So that would mean I've given you a piece of paper which has value because that piece of paper entitles you to receive payments 1 year from today. You're going to get your $10 back, plus you're going to get the 10% interest. And for a $10 loan, that doesn't seem like a very big deal. But when you're talking about billions of dollars of loans, then it is a very big deal. There are many bond type transactions where the maturity is just 1 day. The loan is made today, it's going to be repaid tomorrow. And you might think, well, it's not really worth it. Well, if you're dealing with billions of dollars, then that 1 day of interest can be very important. There are all kinds of bonds. There are bonds issued by corporations. There are bonds issued by all kinds of governments, city governments, state governments, the federal government, all kinds of details. But all of those bonds are just IOUs. And each one, even though it's going to have a lot of complicated language, the most important part of any bond is what is the face value? How much are we talking about? How much is going to be repaid? What is the interest rate? And when is that bond going to mature? Right? Once a bond has been created, it is sold. Let's say Microsoft. Let's say they want to raise $100 billion. Well, one way they could do that would be by printing up $100 billion worth of bonds and selling them. And anybody who wants to buy them can. Why might somebody purchase a bond issued by Microsoft? Well, water savers interested in. They're interested in return and they're interested in risk. So you've got money that you want to save and invest, then you would look at that bond. Say, what is the return I'm being promised? How much risk do I think there is that they're not going to repay me? And then you would look at all the other alternatives open to you. And then you get to choose the option you think best meets your preferences, your desires. There are bond markets throughout the world where companies sell their bonds and where anybody who wants to buy them can purchase them. All bonds involve default risk. That's, again, the risk that the borrower may not, they're promising to make certain payments, but it's always possible that the borrower will not make those payments. A company that is risky, just think about it. You're thinking about buying bonds from a particular company, and then you hear that they're kind of having trouble. They may not be around in 5 years. Then you think they may not honor this agreement. A company in that situation, how can they get somebody to lend to them to buy their bonds? Well, they're going to have to pay a higher interest rate. One of the most important aspects of financial reality is the risk-return trade-off. If you want a higher return, you're going to have to bear more risk. And so you have to decide how much risk you're willing to live with. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, those kind of people, they have to face the risk-return trade-off, and so do we. All of us have to face that trade-off, and that's going to be very important because I think in the future, your own personal investing is going to be really important for your retirement. So you have to make those decisions yourself. You can let somebody else make it for you, but then you're letting them determine what your future is likely to look like. It's one term to be familiar with: collateral, something of value that by agreement becomes the property of the lender if the borrower defaults. If you borrow money to buy a car, what's the collateral? The car. If you stop making payments, it won't be too long until you look out your window and you see a wrecker coming and towing your car away. The lender is seizing the collateral to pay off the loan that you are not paying. So we should expect we will have a graph. We have a graph for the market for loanable funds, which is the whole financial sector. Now we're just talking about the bond market. So you've got a demand, a private demand for funds, but also the government borrows money. The federal government runs a deficit. The government borrows by issuing bonds. The government does not pull out their Discover card and charge $100 billion to it. They borrow money by selling bonds. These are called primarily Treasury securities because they're issued by the U.S. Treasury. So if in this situation we're looking at, if there were no governments borrowing money, then the demand for funds would be here. The interest rate would be at 7%. If we now say, oh, well, the government's running a $100 billion deficit, so they have to borrow an extra $100 billion. Well, this is increasing the demand for funds, and you can see that tends to push interest rates up. Federal budget deficits can cause interest rates to go up, and that can cause very serious problems. This part of economics, I would say, is rather complicated now because the government's running huge deficits. We have very low interest rates. So there's some other things going on that doesn't seem to fit what this is saying. But in our simplest case, government runs a bigger deficit, then that's going to tend to push interest rates up. The idea of crowding out is fairly simple. The idea, or it's referring to a decrease in private consumption and investment that occurs when governments borrow more. The idea is that private sector spending is being crowded out or reduced because the government is spending more. And we can see how that can happen. Going back to our example, the extra $100 billion government government demand for funds pushes the demand curve to the right. You can see it pushes the interest rate up. When the interest rate goes up, what happens to the amount of funds that will be borrowed by the private sector? Before the government ran this deficit, the interest rate was 7%, and the private sector was demanding, or was borrowing $200 billion. Now we're saying a government deficit of $100 billion. Government has to borrow that money. Government borrowing is pushing interest rates up, and when interest rates go up, what do private borrowers do? Well, they may save more, but in terms of borrowing, they're going to borrow less. We're going to move from this point over to that point. Okay? So the private sector is cutting back on its borrowing, which would mean you got people who are going to buy a car, but the interest rate went up, and say, well, I can't afford it, so they don't buy the car. People who are going to buy a house, if the interest rate goes up, so well, I can't afford it now because of the higher interest rate. Crowding out is the decrease in private sector borrowing and spending due to the increased borrowing by the government. Potentially, that is a very serious problem. We're not seeing that happen right now because government is borrowing not $100 billion, but $3 trillion. And yet interest rates are very, very low. So there are other things happening. This doesn't tell the whole story. What this is telling us is if government runs a deficit, other things being equal, that will tend to push interest rates up and will tend to crowd out private sector spending. This is just some details on different types of Treasury securities. We're not going to go into that. One thing to remember, we will talk about this more later, interest rates and bond prices move in opposite directions. Okay? Bonds pay interest. If you decide you want to invest in a bond, then you could go to a broker, say, I want to buy a Treasury security, and he would tell you the price that you're going to have to pay to purchase any given security. What we're saying here is there is an inverse relationship between the price of a bond and interest rates. If bond prices go up, interest rates go down. If bond prices go down, interest rates go up. They move in opposite directions. We're not going to go into why that happens, but I just wanted to mention that. We will come back to it later. You read the financial news, and you see a lot about bond prices and interest rates, and just understanding this basic thing can help you make sense of a lot of things that you see in markets. Okay, stock market. Barely touch on this. What is the difference between buying a stock and buying a bond? If you buy one of the differences, if you invest in a bond, then it's going to tell you the rate of interest you're going to get. If there's a fixed interest rate, that bond is going to pay. Whereas if you invest in stock, There is no fixed interest rate. In fact, nothing is fixed. Okay? That is one of the differences. Key difference is, so when you buy bonds, you are investing in debt. A bond is a debt instrument. When you buy a bond, you're in effect lending money to somebody. Okay? If you purchase bonds issued by Microsoft, then you are lending money to Microsoft. Does that mean you are a part owner of Microsoft? No. You buy bonds, you are investing, you're lending money, that's a debt instrument. On the other hand, stock represents equity. And equity means ownership. If you buy a share of stock in Microsoft, then you are now a part owner of Microsoft. Now, how many shares of Microsoft stock are out there? But it's quite a large number. So if you buy one share of Microsoft stock, you own a very, very tiny part of Microsoft, but you are a part owner. You're not promised any interest. What being a part owner means is that you now own a share of any profit that the company makes in the future. So if they make lots of profit in the future and you're a shareholder, then you're going to share in that. You're going to benefit. If you're a bondholder, you're going to get what you were promised. You're not going to get any of that extra profit. Investing in, if you choose to invest in stock, you are choosing to invest in an asset that has the potential for a higher return, and also what? Failure, higher risk. Stock is a higher potential return, also higher risk. Whereas if you invest in bonds, the return you're likely to get is lower, but the risk you're going to bear is lower as well. So in choosing whether to invest in stocks or bonds, you're making a choice about the risk return trade-off. When a company decides they want to build a new factory or buy new machinery and they need funding, or they want funding, three main alternatives. They can go to a bank, say, we want to borrow money. They can borrow through the bond market. They can sell new bonds, or they can sell additional shares of stock. When they sell additional shares of stock, in effect, they're selling part of the company. Because if they sell new shares of stock, that is bringing more money into the company. The company is now worth more, but the original owners now don't own the entire company. You've got some new owners who own that new stock. So those are the three main alternatives that a company has when they want to raise additional funds. All right, that's all we're going to say about chapter 29. We'll get started in chapter 30. Okay. Unemployment and labor force participation. Take a look at this chart. You always have to slow down when you look at a chart, because you have to look at it for a while to figure out what is there and what's not there. And especially for those of you here, it's probably a little hard to see. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Here, this is the unemployment rate from 1950 through early 2020. Right? The obvious thing you see is that it doesn't stay the same. It fluctuates a lot. Okay? Notice pretty high in the early 50s, went high in the early mid 70s. The gray areas are when the economy was in recession. You can see in the early 80s it went really high up to almost to 11%. Then we had this long period where it was relatively low. Sometimes economists call this great moderation, where it seemed like the economy has become more stable. Things are okay now. We're not going to have bad recessions anymore. And then we get to this gray bar, which is the end of 2007, 2008, 2009. We had the financial crisis, which was dramatically worse than any recession we had had since the Great Depression. And it caught everybody by surprise. And you can see that the unemployment rate went to a little bit over 10%. Okay? But notice I stopped it in early 2020. If we go to here you can see this goes through April of 2020. You see this long unemployment around 5%, down to 3.5% in here, and then boom, 14.7%. A big increase. If we look at this graph, okay. What does this tell you? Are things getting better or are things getting worse? Things are getting better. See, notice I've given you several different graphs. You look at this one, it's like, well, things are getting better. If you look at this one, oh, things are bad. You have to look at not only what's on the axis, but the scale. Okay? Because here I intentionally chose the scale so that it would magnify how bad the early part of the year was. That it was low, but this is only the last 4 years. Okay? And then you see this huge increase. But if you look at this, it doesn't look nearly as bad, but this is only for about 6 months. So if I want to make you think things are getting better, then I can give you a chart that looks like this. It's a lot better. If I give you the previous one, you think, oh, things are terrible. When you see something in the news, recognize there's a good chance that they are choosing what they tell you. They're selecting what they give you to lead you to a certain conclusion. We can pick a graph that makes it look like things are getting better. We can choose a graph that makes it look like things are getting worse. Both are correct graphs that I've just manipulated the amounts of data on the screen, and it presents a different picture. So you have to look carefully at things like the scale. Why did they choose to look at only these months? You're going to really get a sense of what's going on. Notice in September, the last unemployment rate was 7.9%. That's a lot higher than it was back in February when unemployment was only 3.5. But it is a lot lower than it was back in April when it was almost 15%. So things got really bad, but they have improved significantly since then. And probably the graph that would be most useful would be this one. This gives you the big picture from 1950 through September, okay? Which is the most recent. And you can see here that it is not unusual for the unemployment rate to fluctuate a lot. We've seen lots of fluctuation. We've seen unemployment go very high, over 10%. But clearly what we saw back in April was significantly higher than that, almost 15%. And you could make, some people would argue that that really understated how bad things were back in April. But so you had this really bad period, but then notice it has gone down significantly. If we want to have a sense of where things really are, you've got to look at the big picture. And somebody gives you data, always ask, are they selectively giving me data to get me to reach a particular conclusion? Okay. Another piece of information that's useful to be aware of. What I was talking about a moment ago was the unemployment rate that is reported once a month for the and what we were looking at was for the whole country. Another useful number is initial unemployment claims. This comes out every week on Thursday. So it's a source of data where you can see very clearly or very quickly what's going on in the economy. I think it's maybe delayed 2 weeks. So you can see what happened 2 weeks ago. And it's telling you how many people lost their job, and filed for unemployment during that week. And you can see, look at the scale. Okay, the lowest number there is 1 million. You can see that most of the time we're way below 1 million. So that looks like it's very low, but still we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Even when the economy is doing great, in an average week, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people who lose their jobs. And you're going to have other people who find new jobs. We have a dynamic economy that's changing all the time. And so it's not surprising when you have hundreds of thousands of people filing for unemployment in a given week. But you can see, obviously, I think that was April, early April, that is literally off the chart. Whereas before it was way below, the high was, I think, around 600,000. This was 6.6 million. So there's no way to get around the fact that what happened during that period was cataclysmic for the economy and for lots of individual people. When we talk about unemployed workers, what do we mean? You might think, well, that's obvious, but it's really not. We're talking about adults who do not have a job, but who are looking for work. And the unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force without a job. To make this more clear, someone is counted as unemployed only if he or she is willing and able to work, but cannot find a job. So you have to be willing and able, you have to be looking, but be without a job. To be counted as unemployed, must be at least 16, not institutionalized. You're not in prison, you're not in a mental institution, you're not in an old folks home. You're a civilian, in the military, that they're counted completely separately, so they don't show up here. And you have to be actively looking for work. Those are the requirements to be considered unemployed. Think about it like this. What you see here represents the whole country. You have some people who are employed. That's pretty obvious. Those people have jobs. You have people who are unemployed, who are considered unemployed. That means they're at least 16, they're not institutionalized. They're willing to work. They're actively looking for work, but they don't have a job. Notice unemployed plus unemployed, the total is called the labor force. That's an important thing to remember. So you got people who are employed, people who are unemployed. You might think, well, that should be everybody, but absolutely not. There are many people who are not considered to be in the labor force. And as it says here, well, who would be considered not a part of the labor force? If you're 15, children. If you're below 16, you're not a part of the labor force. If you're in old folks home, mental institution, prison, the army, you are not considered a part of the labor force. If you don't have a job, but you're not looking for work, you are not a part of the labor force. You might want to say, but well, I think you should be. Well, we're interested in how does the government measure these things, and this is how they measure them. And this would be the only calculation that you need to have some understanding of from chapter 30. Calculating the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed workers divided by the labor force. Okay? The number of unemployed workers divided by the labor force. You need to know that. Who's the labor force? The number of unemployed workers plus the number of employed workers. Okay? Population, where does that fit into this equation? Where do you see it? It's not there. Okay? So anytime you have a question about calculating the unemployment rate, you see population, that's not relevant. Okay? The unemployment rate, the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. Who's considered unemployed? Or who's a part of the labor force? People who are unemployed plus people who are employed. Divide this by that, that gives you the unemployment rate. And you need to be able to do that calculation. And here are numbers that take you through how that is done. And here's an example. You have 2 million people who are unemployed, 8 million who are employed. What's the unemployment rate? Work that out yourself. Don't look at the answer here. But you can come back and look at it after you've worked it out yourself. People have a lot of trouble with this calculation, but it's very, very simple. Okay? And this shows you how you go about calculating that. Okay? All right. Like I said, from chapter 30, we haven't covered very much, but I do want you to understand some of these things we have covered, such as how to calculate the unemployment rate. And I will put up something, a short video. It won't be very long. It won't be the whole chapter. I'll have it up by noon tomorrow. Okay? Any questions?